So, when you hear the word Puritan, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For a lot of us, it's probably someone super stern, always dressed in black, just completely against having any fun. But that's really just a caricature. Today, we're going to dig way past that stereotype and find out what Puritanism was actually all about.
And that really gets us to the big question, right? What was the heart of Puritanism? This is not a new question, by the way. It's a historical puzzle that scholars have been wrestling with for a long, long time, and the answers they've come up with are pretty fascinating.
For decades, all these thinkers have tried to boil this really complex movement down to just one single core concept. They're searching for its essence, that one key idea that unlocks everything else. So let's investigate what they came up with.
Okay, so the first major theory is this, that the absolute sovereignty of God in salvation, or predestination, was the central pillar of all Puritan thought. This is the idea that God chooses from the very beginning of time who's going to be saved. For some scholars, this incredibly powerful doctrine was the engine that drove the entire movement.
But then you have a second group of thinkers, and they argue that the real key isn't predestination at all, but something called covenant theology. This is the idea that God relates to us through these binding agreements, or covenants. They believed God set up a covenant of grace, promising to be their God if they'd live by faith in his Son. And this idea of a divine promise, it shaped their whole world.
And then there's a third view. This one says the true essence wasn't some lofty doctrine in your head, but a really profound personal experience, conversion. That moment of transformation, that heartfelt journey from spiritual darkness into light. For these folks, this personal piety was the real heartbeat of Puritanism. And this quote from the historian Richard Hawkes just nails the problem. You've got all these different threads, right? You've got the theological, the political, and the intensely personal. And they all seem absolutely essential. So was it about doctrine? Was it about the rights of citizens? Or was it about this heartfelt religion? Trying to pick just one? Well, it just makes the puzzle even more complicated. So this leads us to a really crucial insight. What if looking for just one piece of the puzzle, one single answer, is the wrong way to go about it entirely? What if the essence of Puritanism isn't an essence at all? And here it is. This is the key insight. The Puritans based their entire worldview on the Bible. And think about it. You can't just boil the Bible down to one single theme, can you? It's too big, too rich. Well, it was the same for the Puritans. Their beliefs were simply too comprehensive to be squeezed into one single idea.
So if it's not one single thing, what is it? Well, now we get to break it down. We're going to explore the major pillars that the Puritans themselves were always emphasizing in their own lives and their own writings.
It turns out there were really four main pillars holding up their whole worldview. First, and at the absolute center of everything, was the Trinitarian God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Second, they were deeply, deeply committed to the church. They even had something called the regulatory principle, which meant they believed worship should only include what's explicitly commanded in the Bible, no human inventions. Third, they focused on the individual's personal journey. Faith wasn't just for Sundays. It had to transform your entire life, at home, at work, everywhere. And finally, they believed the Bible should guide national life, telling everyone from the king to the average person about their duties and their rights. Okay, so we've got all those pieces on the table now. Theology, the church, individual life, even politics. Let's try and put them all together to build a final, much more complete definition of what Puritanism really was. The scholar Peter Lewis gives us this fantastic way of looking at it. He argues that Puritanism didn't just appear out of nowhere. It actually grew out of three fundamental needs people felt at the time: a real hunger for solid biblical preaching, a deep desire for a genuine personal faith guided by the Holy Spirit, and a need to get back to a biblical simplicity in how the church was run and how it worshiped. Now, what's really cool about this is how it brings everything together. It shows us that Puritanism was a complete worldview. Doctrinally, sure, it was a vigorous kind of Calvinism. But look at this. Experientially, it was described as warm and contagious. That's a world away from the cold stereotype we started with, isn't it? Evangelistically, they were urgent. In the church, everything was focused on God. And politically, they were trying to find a scriptural balance, always bound by their conscience. So where does that leave us? Puritanism wasn't one single idea. It was a comprehensive, passionate, and deeply held vision for all of life. And that leaves us with one last question to chew on.
How might a 400-year-old movement that was so dedicated to this idea of godly living in every part of life, how might that still challenge our own ideas about faith, society, and personal life today?